Well, welcome to the Tower Center. We are going to start the program. I am Hiroki Takeuchi, Director of Soundstar Program on Japan East Asia in the Tower Center. This is the 21st of the 24 events this semester, which is quite crazy. It would be impossible without our staff members, Luis De Rosao, Ji-Eun Pyun, and Cindy Thompson over there. Please join for the applause. And also, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, which makes Tower Center really enjoyable place to work at. Josh Rovner, acting director of the Tower Center, and Diana Newton, my predecessor of the director of Soundstar Program, and one of the few Japan specialists in the campus. And my new colleague, Nicholas Sternsdahl-Cisterna, anthropologist, who joined us this fall. One of his projects is Japanese culture of food, I think. If you have some question, he may answer. He may give you a good answer. Also, I would like to acknowledge John Stitt, Honorary Consul General of Japan. I really appreciate his support. And I would like to thank Japan Society Dallas-Fort Worth, especially many thanks to Anna McFarland, Executive Director. Okay, now I'd like to pass the podium to President of the DCFR and Sharon Venable.
This is a little bit of a maze through here. Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Sharon Venable, the CEO for the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations. And while I'm at it, I'll just recognize Hugh Hackney, who is our incoming president of the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations. We have a number of Dallas Committee folks here tonight. Deidre Williams is hosting a group of people that she's brought in for the evening. We thank her for that. The Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations is a 28-year-old organization founded by people that if you've been around a little bit here in Dallas, will know. Richard Fisher, Phil Montgomery, and Dr. Dennis O'Brien. Unfortunately, Richard is the only surviving member of the founders, but 28 years ago, they found a need for a information, education, high-level discussion about foreign policy and foreign issues in Dallas, Texas. And I think the rest is history. We have programs that bring in speakers such as Sheila Smith and others who can talk at a high level about the topics that we're interested in. We operate under this Chatham House rule, which means anything that the speaker said is not for attribution. So we hope to have very candid discussions. We're very pleased to be part of the Tower Center's presentation and bringing Dr. Smith to Dallas. It's been a little bit of a trying day for her, so without further ado, I want to let her be the person that is really important, and I'm sure Hiroki wants to introduce you. So anyway, thank you all for coming tonight.
Well, I apologize. I forgot one important person, Hans Hepp, Honorary Consul General of Germany in Dallas. The last year, Soundstar program was reorganized from Soundstar program in Japanese studies into Soundstar program on Japan East Asia. And so we have received a grant from the Japan Foundation, and we want to respond to the increasing importance of China. But at the same time, we wondered whether Japan is still important for the United States. And our answer is yes. Japan is still important for the US to manage China. So today's program, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and Rising China, fits best to the Sunstar program, I would say. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Sheila Smith. So this year there are three important events for the US-Japan relationship. Prime Minister Abe's visit to US in April, security legislation passed Diet in September, and the conclusion of international negotiation of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, in October. None of them is officially related to China. However, all of them are related to China. Well, Prime Minister Abe did not mention China at all in his speech in US Congress, but everybody talked about China. When I was participating in a discussion regarding US-Japan relationship in DC at the time. Prime Minister Abe avoided mentioning China in the Diet discussion about the security legislation. However, it's obvious that China is behind it. And China was not a negotiating partner of the TPP. However, everybody, including President Obama, said that the United States, not China, should be the driver's seat of rulemaking of international economy. Dr. Sheila Smith would be the best person to talk about the complex China-Japan-US triangular relationship. We all know that domestic politics matters for international relations in some way, but the question is how. The subtitle of her book, Japanese Domestic Politics and the Rising China, suggests she may give us a hint to answer that complex question. Dr. Smith is Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I will not I will not talk about, give the official introduction of her, but I mention two things. One, she is simply one of the foremost experts on Japan. And then two, I'm very pleased that she has just joined the advisory committee of Mansfield Foundation's US-Japan Network for the Future, of which I'm a member. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Hiroki. I am delighted to be here in Dallas. It's wonderful to be back at the Tower Center. This is my second time at SMU, my third or fourth time in Dallas. So I'm delighted to be back on this rainy day, and I'm delighted that there's so many smiling faces to greet me. So thank you for that. I'm going to do a little reorganizing here because this microphone is moving and it's making noises. There are so many questions in Hiroki's introduction that I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to all of them, but I wanted to share with you a little bit of my perspective on the way in which Japan is changing, largely in response to a rising China. And I'll talk a little bit about my book and why I wrote a book called Intimate Rivals in International Relations. I get a lot of teasing about the title. But I'll tell you a little bit about how I approached this topic and what motivated me to write the book and what I write about in the book. But then I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit, bring this back to what this means for the United States. And I sit in the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, and it's a very busy place these days for Japan specialists, largely because there is a perception in the region, as well as in the United States, that Japan may be moving to the right, that Mr. Abe may be taking Japan in a new direction, that we're not quite sure about what this means for the traditional alliance relationship with Washington, between Washington and Tokyo. I am here to assert that the alliance between the United States and Japan is very strong. So I'm not here to question the alliance in any way. But it's in a new context in Asia. It's in a very fluid and geostrategically significant moment in the Asia Pacific. And the Japanese people now perceive their security in a very different way than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So the alliance has to accommodate this difference, these different perceptions on the part of Japan. It also has to reassure the Japanese people, as well as speak to others in the Asia Pacific who are looking to see what the U.S. and Japan are going to do. And one of the countries that watch the U.S. and Japan most closely is China. So we'll all come around full circle to try to address all of Hiroki's questions. But let me start a little bit about the book. I began doing the research. We're not supposed to confess how long it takes us to write books, I know, especially academics. But anyway, I started this book, the research on this book in 2007, 2008. And I know that sounds like a very long time, but I'll tell you, it felt like I didn't have enough time to finish the book. Events were changing so quickly. So I had a manuscript 2 years ago that kept having to get updated. Every time it came back from the publisher, I had to add, if not a new chapter, at least some amendments to the chapter. Luckily, the overall thesis held, even though events were changing so quickly. But in 2008, what I was focused on was what most Japan foreign policy experts were focused on, and that is that leaders, the government leaders and experts in Tokyo were increasingly unable to manage their relationship with China. There had been a series of incidents and not necessarily crises. Remember, 2008 is before the territorial dispute erupts, right? Which was 2010 and then again in 2012. So I'm still going on a pre-territorial dispute Japan-China relationship. And already what you could see is trade disputes. You could see differences over the traditional Japanese practice of giving China overseas development assistance or development assistance to help them with their transformation to a market economy. You could see tensions always, but reemerging over the history issue, especially the controversial Yasukuni Shrine. But you could see these new issues emerge. Maritime boundaries. The East China Sea became a much more contested place between Chinese and Japanese ships, fishermen, militaries, coast guards. And again, this is prior to the territorial dispute that erupted in 2010. So I began this project by saying, okay, what's going on in this relationship? I didn't start out to write a book about Japan's response to a rising China. So that subtitle came later. And what I understood was a lot of Japanese scholars talked to me about generational change. We don't know the leaders in China as well anymore. And that, many of you will know, was also true of American leaders. They didn't know the fifth generation of Chinese leadership that were coming to the fore. They didn't know Xi Jinping. They didn't know who was coming in that fifth generation of Chinese leaders. But the Japanese conservatives in particular, the liberal Democrats, had always had a pretty good relationship with the Communist Party of China, believe it or not. They don't believe in the same things, but the personal networks they had spent a long time cultivating. And that was eroding. That was no longer possible to gauge who would be next, but also to know that you knew the guy who would be next. And that same was true on the Japanese side. Japanese politics by 2008, remember, were also changing. And in 2009, the Japanese voters, for the first time in the post-war, really elected an opposition party to rule their country. And the Democratic Party of Japan came in September 2009 with no foreign policy experience, no governing experience, with some members of the party who had had experience when they had been in the Conservative Party before, but they really didn't, as a party, have a vision for how to conduct Japanese foreign policy. And they didn't have what the Japanese call a pipe to China. They didn't have those personal networks. Some of them independently did, but they really didn't, as a party, have vehicles for talking to the Chinese about problems. So again, in 2008, you could see that in both sides of the East China Sea, the issues were getting more complex, and the ways of solving those differences were not, the old ways were not working. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle, and I write about this in more detail in the book, is that the public was getting much more engaged. The Japanese public was beginning to perceive this transforming China, this big next-door neighbor, not as a country that would be looked at sort of as a long-time cultural, right, source of learning, a place where they sought reconciliation after the war, but rather as a competitor, as a country that was exporting very complex problems like poisoned food, and that was really, really kind of creating an environment in Northeast Asia that the Japanese public was not very sure about. So the public piece of the puzzle, I argue in my book, is a large part of the reason why the Japanese and Chinese governments were having more trouble. Now, I'm not a Chinese domestic politics specialist. Hiroki can help you with that. But I'm looking at the domestic side on the Japanese, and what you see in polling data, the consecutive polling data year by year by year over the 2000s, is a linear trajectory that looks like a 45-degree angle, straight up. In Japanese public skepticism about the government of the People's Republic of China. Now, some of this is born of incidents, and the incidents are really what I write about in the book. Yasukuni Shrine visits. Chinese got very critical of that during Prime Minister Koizumi's tenure. The Japanese public began to see this as intruding into domestic politics, right? No thank you. China. I write about the maritime boundary dispute. Little bit of public attention to that, not as much. I write about the food security issue, one chapter, and that is, again, a very big, high-profile case of poisoned dumpling arrived. 2 prefectures in Japan, 2 families were sick, went to the hospital. Nobody died, but was very, very, very seriously ill. Turns out that those poisoned dumpling had been deliberately poisoned. It wasn't just bad health practice or sanitation practice in China. They had deliberately been injected with a poison that you could not buy in Japan. It was not easily available. So again, by the end of the day, it was clear that these gyoza, dumplings, frozen dumplings, had been processed in China by a Japanese company, right? In a factory in China. And so the sub-story of the food security chapter in my book is not that the Chinese are being bad to Japan. It was that the economic interdependence between Japan and China was sufficiently progressed to have Japanese producing their food in China, subcontracting Chinese factories to produce food for Japanese companies. So what the Japanese consumer got at their table was a package with a Japanese company's name, a very trusted food producer of Japan. They had no idea, there was no labeling, there was nothing to indicate that these had been produced anywhere but in Japan. But they had not. The origin of that food had been in China. So the food safety, that's the one chapter of my book that I had the most fun. Frankly, it's not a fun topic, I apologize, but it was the most interesting one to kind of delve into, because all of a sudden you're seeing that the complexity of this relationship between Japan and China, it's not just the Chinese and the Japanese have issues about the past, or the Chinese and the Japanese governments can't figure out their common interests. It's really about the complexity of the deeply interdependent relationship between the Japanese and Chinese, that many Japanese, and I suspect Chinese, are unaware of how deeply interdependent these 2 economies have become. So that was one of the puzzles for me, and that was one of the stories for me. And then the last chapter, of course, has to do with traditional military security issues, and the territorial dispute, of course, erupted, and that made that chapter a lot longer and a lot more detailed than it might otherwise have been. But the territorial issue was the icing on the cake of a book that really was trying to figure out what was it that was really causing these difficulties between the 2 countries, and why, inside Japan, were you increasingly getting frustration with their own government's inability to solve these problems with China. Now, the finger pointing is certainly there. A lot of people said to me, well, is this a book about Japanese nationalism? In fact, when the book was just out on Amazon.com, it was underneath nationalism as a title, which I thought was very interesting. The Amazon.com people, I don't know how they classify books, but they immediately put my book under the nationalism category, which is really interesting. But the thesis, I began to look for signs of interest group activity, of political entrepreneurship, for lack of a better word, that would suggest that there was a social movement or a broader network of activism that was building around the China issue. In other words, is there a collective political movement building towards an anti-China kind of mode? Typically, this is what we think of when we think of nationalism. And the 4 chapters that I describe, I didn't find it across these chapters. I found it in the Yasukuni chapter. I have a chapter that really does a deep dive onto Yasukuni Shrine and the politics of it, including Mr. Koizumi. That's the cover of the book. That's Prime Minister Koizumi going to Yasukuni Shrine, like most politicians do, in a suit with his little lapel button, which suggests that he's a member of the Japanese parliament, and he goes in, makes his offering, very matter of fact, and leaves. Often when you think about the headlines and the newspaper coverage of Yasukuni Shrine visits, you have everybody dressed up in tuxedo, it's August 15th, it's very formalized. But that's the way most Japanese politicians go to Yasukuni, in the spring and in the fall. They go, they present their offering, and they go back to their office and go do their work. But the shrine visits that made by Koizumi, beginning in 2001 and continuing till the time he left office in 2006, reopened that wound of the way in which the Japanese commemorate the veterans in Japan. And it reopened lots of questions inside Japan about whether or not the Yasukuni Shrine, the controversial Shinto shrine that was the emperor's shrine for telling those who went off to fight for modern Japan in the name of the emperor, telling them that they would die in the name of the emperor, and the emperor would honor their souls at Yasukuni when they returned. So again, this was a shrine that was developed in the Meiji period when Japan was not yet a modern nation, but needed a conscript army. Should I worry about that? Yeah, the Yasukuni Shrine talking makes the lights go off. It makes me a little nervous. But this was very much associated, of course, with Japan's progression expansion out into Asia and the World War II in the Asia Pacific, right? Today, Yasukuni Shrine is not the national place of commemoration of the end of the war, but it is a place where many Japanese political leaders go, and where many of the veterans' families believe that their veterans ought to be honored, right? The story starts there. I thought my point was simply to say that the war memory story is always there, and the way in which the Japanese think about their past, and especially about those who died in the war, will always, I think, be part of the conversation between Japan and China. There you can see nationalist advocacy. There you can go to the bookstore and buy books that have in their preface Mr. Abe, before he came back as Prime Minister, talking about his commitment to Yasukuni Shrine as a national shrine of Japan. There, if you go on a particular day, August 15th, being the day that the Japanese commemorate the end of the war, you will find big black trucks with smoky windows and blaring megaphones and signs, big red Japanese flags. You'll find all kinds of people go to Yasukuni with different motives. Some of them activists, some of them families, and some of them politically, hoping to make get a little bit credibility with their conservative base. But beyond that issue, you didn't find the same groups that were organized around Yasukuni nationalism in the food security issue. You didn't find them organized on the maritime boundary issue. You didn't even find the same people organized around the territorial dispute, the senkaku nationalism is what I call it in the book. So issue by issue by issue, you didn't see the same interest groups organizing themselves, making alliances across these issues to come together against China. But what China has done, on the flip side, is opened up some of the issues that for many Japanese had long resided in a kind of marginal space in Japanese politics, right? Yasukuni got a little bit more mainstream when Koizumi came into power in 2000. Senkaku had always been kind of off there, little islands in the East China Sea, quietly managed between the two governments, and only some particularly obstreperous right-wing small groups would go out and plant flags or would go out and rent boats to get out to the islands. You didn't see it in mainstream Japanese politics. Of course, the government always had a position. Senkaku Islands are ours. Here's a fact sheet. This is why we think they're ours. We will never say that there's a dispute. These are ours. So the government had a position on the issue. But it didn't mobilize mass politics until 2010, when that Chinese fishing trawler captain ran into two Coast Guard ships. And the DPJ, which was in power at the time, arrested him, his crew, his ship, and then they detained him for indictment under Japanese domestic law. And that was the first time the Japanese government had ever decided to try to prosecute a Chinese national over the issue of these islands, either a fisherman or an activist. They'd never ever sought to prosecute them under Japanese domestic law in the past. They'd handed them over the next day to the Chinese, or the next week. They had been quietly let go, but that had changed with the decision in 2010. What also changed in 2010, however, was that the Chinese fishing captain, a little under the influence apparently, deliberately rammed the Coast Guard cutters that sought to move him away from the Senkaku Islands. And I'm going to show you some maps and some pictures in just a second, but the only reason I'm bringing this up now is that these islands are very remote. They're out in the middle of the Black Current. They're out in a place where for most mariners, it's a very hard place to be if you sink, or if you get in trouble, or if you're stuck in a typhoon. It's a fairly treacherous, straight bunch of water. So the danger here that any of those ships would have gone down was very, very high. The danger that they would not have been rescued had they gone down was also very, very high. So the Japanese prosecuted the drunken trawler captain, basically on the charge of resisting arrest. They didn't charge him for much more than that, but it was obstructing the duty of the Japanese Coast Guard. That in and of itself doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But what it propelled in Japanese politics was a whole debate, first about the DPJ's leadership. Did they handle it well? Did they kowtow to Beijing? Lots of rhetoric. Because remember, at this point in time, the conservative LDP is out of office. They had quietly managed this issue with the Chinese since the peace treaty of 1978. They were very nicely positioned politically to give the DPJ a really hard time about how they mishandled the dispute. At that time, I went to Tokyo not long after the incident happened. And it was striking to me that you watch the bilateral tension grow between Japan and China. And the Chinese impose an informal embargo on rare earth minerals, making it very hard for Japanese corporations that depended on the supply to operate. When the Japanese courts finally did decide to extend the detention of the fishing captain, Chinese government then detained 4 Japanese businessmen in China on the assumption that they were spying on a military base, right? So basically you had hostages on both sides. And that was the final resolution. That was the final step. Foreign Minister Maehara came to talk to Secretary Clinton. Secretary Clinton made a straightforward statement that those islands are under the administrative control of Japan and therefore under Article 5 protection of the United States. Wen Jiabao went to the United Nations General Assembly. It's just around the General Assembly meeting in September in New York. He gave a stirring speech to Chinese Americans in New York the night before the opening of the General Assembly, saying that China will stop at nothing if they don't get that fishing captain back. So both sides are now not talking to each other diplomatically. They're going outside the typical framework for dispute resolution, the bilateral channel that they've always used to deal with this issue. But what happens then becomes a very rapid resolution. Okay, fine, here's your captain. The captain gets handed back. The Naha prosecutor makes the announcement. It doesn't get announced from the Prime Minister's office. It was very sloppy. So the DPJ got a lot of pushback internally over their mishandling of this, that they looked weak in the face of Chinese pressure. The larger change that happened, and I'll make 2 more comments and then we can talk a little bit about the U.S., what this means for the United States. But the implication of this was that the domestic debate in Japan itself began to focus on China, on what kind of response to China would have been appropriate. What kind of defense debate should Japan have? How was the Coast Guard expected to protect now these remote islands, right, that now were beginning to be more and more under the gaze of China? So you began to get people and entrepreneurs like Ishihara Shintaro, the very obviously right-wing leader of Tokyo, governor of Tokyo, who had long been attached to the Senkaku issue. He became a very outspoken critic of the central government. He at some point began to advocate that Tokyo metropolitan government, 13 million people, a local government, but nonetheless a metropolitan government, should raise money and purchase these islands from their owners and defend them properly against the Chinese. Right? He came to Washington. He went to the Heritage Foundation. He gave a speech on television. You can look it up, right? Anytime you're interested, you can go hear him speak. And it was a very wandering kind of... He's in his 80s. He was not very coherent until he got to the part about the Senkakus. And then he was crisp as could be in Washington. And he said, it's time that the Senkakus were properly defended by Japan. And since our central government can't do it, I, as the governor of Tokyo, will. So he threw down the gauntlet in the best stage possible, which is in a trip to Washington, D.C., right? And all the Japanese political reporters that I knew said we had to follow him around to the Sakura Matsuri, and we had to listen to him talk about things that really weren't important until he said that at the Heritage. And they said if he'd said that in Tokyo, none of us would have thought it was anything different than his normal ramblings about the Senkakus. But because he went to Washington, it was on a global stage, it took on a whole different significance. The long and the short of it is, a lot of the advocacy by Ishihara, he raised money from the public, raised millions overnight to purchase the senkakus. A lot of his advocacy in other parts of the political spectrum in Japan raised this issue of the senkakus and placed inordinate pressure on the central government to purchase these islands, make sure that they were adequately defended against the Chinese. So that's the issue, I think, that has transformed the politics the most in all of the 4 issues that I talked about of China policy. And this was the one issue where Japan's own security, its own ability to defend territory, and the way in which it had organized its debate in the post-war period around security, including the alliance, was becoming detrimental to Japan's own security needs. In other words, Japan had to think more carefully about what China's ambitions really were. And when I show you the pictures of these little islands, you'll be surprised at how remote they are, and that they are unpopulated. Nobody lives there but seagulls and some goats. But this has become emblematic of what Japan needs to do to change its post-war pacifism or its post-war resistance to protecting itself against outside encroachment by China. So the territorial dispute, the last of my case studies, is kind of the way in which you see that the politics, the domestic politics in Japan, begin to coalesce in a way that hadn't in the past. But it still doesn't give you a picture of Japanese nationalism, right? It still doesn't give you a Japanese public that is deeply interested in and willing to expand its military power. So when Hiroki was introducing me, he mentioned that there was a debate over new security legislation in Tokyo this summer. And if any of you were in Tokyo this summer, you'll know that there were tens of thousands of Japanese demonstrators out on the streets when Mr. Abe was trying to implement his changes in the way that the Japanese military would operate. So I would suggest to you that while China now pushes a lot of the debate inside Japan about defense and about foreign policy, it's in the shadows of just about every geostrategic decision made by Japanese leaders. Scratch a little, you'll find China. You scratch a little, you'll find, well, that's because we have to compete with China. So China motivates the debate inside Japan, but it doesn't necessarily determine the future direction that Japan will go. So let me conclude with a couple of sentences here about what does this mean for the United States. I was sitting at CFR in the Washington office from the time that the fishing trawler captain rammed the Coast Guard ships, a couple years before that, but I was there through the whole escalation of the tensions and watching our government try to comprehend and deal with it. It was fascinating in lots of ways. The Japanese response was fascinating, but so was ours. And I'll give you a couple of changes that I think it's wrought in the relationship between Tokyo and Washington. The first is we were startled. I think everybody was startled. First, by the intensity of the Chinese escalation of the diplomatic crisis in 2010. There was a certain amount of surprise that China amped it up so quickly. The rare earths, the arrests, the pressure points, that they used that kind of pressure points as opposed to direct dialogue with Tokyo was a surprise. Always the Chinese and Japanese have preferred to talk to each other rather than to go out to others. So that was a surprise. It opened up, it wasn't really a military crisis, or it didn't seem to have the kind of, it was a diplomatic crisis for us. And we just needed to be clear about our position on the senkakus in order to reassure Japan. That was the first cut at it. In 2012, when the purchase of the islands then provoked the Chinese into sending their Coast Guard out to patrol the islands, then it began to take on a different dimension. Granted, there were 2 Coast Guards. They were in the islands. Both countries' publics were deeply enraged, right? Both saw and described, if you watch the television coverage, CCTV or Japan, in the Japanese programs, this was very focused on, those are our islands, this is our territory, we must defend them, right? But I think there was a little bit of the U.S. trying to say, okay, let's try to calm this down. Let's try to figure out how to get to a solution. Japan, remember, in the fall of 2012, began to head towards an election for their lower house. Mr. Abe had not become prime minister yet at that point. Remember that he inherits the island dispute. He wasn't there at the creation, right? But what you're starting to see in September and October was a little bit more military activity. No shooting, no guns, but just forces in the air, forces in the water, and the U.S. side was picking up that there was a little bit more willingness for the militaries to get in a little bit closer proximity to the islands. And this was something that Washington was not very happy about. By the time Mr. Abe does come into power, you get a small Chinese surveillance aircraft going over the top of the islands for the very first time. In other words, intruding into Japanese airspace. Not a military plane, right? Still, you're in the civilian maritime forces, right? But in January of 2013, you get a radar lock incident where a Chinese ship locks its fire control radar on a Japanese ship, which is the equivalent of targeting with the intention to shoot, right? No response, no actual shooting. But then you start to get this dimension of this could actually, through miscalculation, through an inadvertent action by a commander or a fighter pilot, this could inadvertently lead to a kind of clash where we were not quite sure how it would end in the end, right? At the time, the admiral at PACOM, Admiral Locklear at the time, came to the council, and I asked him, I said, okay, so if something goes wrong, who's going to win? And he said, the Japanese, without a doubt, have a far stronger naval capacity, and they are much, much more professionally trained in maritime operations than the Chinese. But it's not the first round that you have to worry about. It's the second and the third and the fourth, and the political consequences of an actual use of force incident. So our policy focus has been since then is to make sure that the United States is very clear that we do not support coercive attempts to change the status quo in and around the Senkaku Islands. That under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, we treat territory under the administrative, see the speakeasy, the language comes very easy. Territory under the administration of Japan, we afford Article 5 protections. So President Obama last year went to Tokyo. He made this statement in Tokyo to the Japanese public largely to reassure them, but also clearly to communicate to Beijing. The final thought on this, the territorial piece of the puzzle here, is that even though Japan and China today have reopened their diplomatic dialogue, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abe have met twice. They will meet again this month and again probably in December. They are working on a military-to-military confidence-building risk reduction agreement across the East China Sea. Regular diplomacy has begun. Investment by the Japanese in China has begun to resume, although it's not anywhere near its former levels. And most people in Japan feel fairly confident that the diplomacy is back on track. But for the U.S.-Japan alliance, what has fundamentally changed is that our perception today is it is entirely conceivable that you could have a use of force incident against Japan first, before the United States is involved. And that's the first for our alliance with Japan in the post-war period. Up until now, the U.S.-Japan alliance has organized itself around the possibility of a Korean contingency, perhaps a Taiwan contingency, but never a direct use of force incident against Japan. Nobody thought anybody would ever think of using force against Japan. So this year, one of the biggest changes in our policy agenda was that we concluded and revised the U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Guidelines, which built in some of the crisis management mechanisms that were needed in terms of how do you think about this alliance given this new setting in which, again, inadvertently or accidentally, something might happen that might escalate the two countries to the point of actually using force against each other. And what would be the American role? And how would the United States participate in a crisis management attempt to prevent that kind of conflict from emerging? Let me stop there. I'm sure you have lots of questions and comments, and I'd rather answer your questions and continue to give you all the details of my book. But I brought some maps on the island disputes and also the maritime boundary disputes, which if you're interested in those issues, we can certainly explore in a little bit more detail. But thank you.
The map was very interesting. So
Do you show you maps? I can show you maps, sure. All right, so let me give you a quick visual. This is what I do in my classes. I teach a class at Georgetown on island disputes in Asia. So this will take you a little bit beyond the Japan-China relationship. So there you have a nice visual. We talk a lot about Japan, China, and the Senkaku. You guys hear me okay if I don't have the mic?
Yeah.
Do I need the mic? Okay, I'll use the mic. So we think about this island dispute between Japan and China as being, defining the relationship, but the reality is Asia, East Asia in particular, is full of island disputes at the moment. Not all of them involving China, right? Let's see if I can use this pointer. Is this right? Can't find my little dot. Anybody see a red dot?
It's on the ceiling.
It's on the ceiling. Oh, there you go. Thank you. So up here, Japan and the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, now Russia, have a dispute, right, over the sovereignty of the Kurils. Japan refers to this as Northern Territories. Liancourt Rocks is the politically correct way to refer to what the Japanese call Takeshima and the South Koreans call Dokdo. Islands here. Senkakus are down here. We can get into North Korea, and Yeonpyeong-do Island, which you may remember in 2010 was shelled by the North Koreans, but that's a South Korean island there that the North and South are conflicted over. You get down here into the South China Sea, and I'll look a little bit more at the maritime issues in just a second, and you've got Scarborough Shoal, which is what the Philippines and China contested, and China basically has gotten the upper hand on that one. Reed Bank is where the Chinese and the Filipinos are still squabbling at the moment. There's a whole host of islands down here called the Spratlys, which is, you've been watching your CNN, you will know that this is where the Chinese are doing massive land reclamation projects on 3 islands down here, and the paracels are China and Vietnam. So when the United States, at the end of the Vietnam War, when the United States left, the Chinese moved in and claimed an island called Woody Island. They have a major facility there. So basically, you'll see China as the huge continental power of Asia. When China looks out, it sees U.S. allies and friends. It also sees lots of territories that it feels were taken from it, right? During either as war booty or as part of Western imperialism, which is a lot of the language that you'll hear about the South China Sea. So Asia, East Asia, is all about these islands. It's also about all of the navies and the maritime forces now that are beginning to occupy this maritime space off of China's shores. Here's the Senkakus, and this is the map I wanted to show you about where these islands are and what they're like. The only time that the Senkakus have been inhabited, is Uotsuri, which is the biggest island of the Senkakus. And that's where there was a factory with about 200 very impoverished Japanese who were there from about the late 1800s or early 1900s into the 1930s when it became impossible to stay there. There's no natural source of water on these islands. So rainwater is the only thing you get to drink if you live out there. It is now inhabited by lots of goats that were left over from the time when the Japanese actually lived out there, when those 200 people had the factory. It was a bonito factory and a guano production for Taiwan, which was used as fertilizer back then. For those of you who don't know, guano is seabird poop. But it was a very rich source of fertilizer, and the Taiwanese bought it from that little island. So this island, Kitakojima, Minamikojima, and Uotsuri were privately owned by a family called the Kuriharas. Kuba is rented. This is an island the U.S. military used to use as a bombing range when the United States administered Okinawa, and it's still under the government of Japan's control because of that, no longer used. Taisho has always been, from the very beginning, was a Meiji government. It was a government island. There's nothing you can do with this island. It's a big rock. But basically this island, I mean, what this is designed to show you is just how far away this is. Ishigaki is where most of the fishermen reside who fish in and around the Senkakus, the Japanese fishermen. Northern Taiwan is where the Taiwanese fishermen go. So the ancient fishing grounds that were largely shared by people from what used to be the Ryukyu kingdom and the Taiwanese. Chinese fishermen rarely venture that far offshore. And only in very recent times do you see them venturing off here to this island. It's a long way away. When you talk about little propeller planes, Chinese propeller planes going over the top of these islands, the Japanese air defenses come from Naha. So this is where their fighter jets fly to. And they are not visible on a typical radar. From any small craft going over the top of the islands is not visible. So the Japanese military now is building a radar station on an island a lot closer so they can monitor it appropriately. The Chinese are also building a new Coast Guard station just directly across from the Senkaku. So this is not going to go away. The balance of forces in and around these islands are going to grow. But at the moment, they are reasonably predictable in how they're both behaving. Interesting to see the other side of the picture from the Chinese side, of course. And again, this is from our DoD report that looks at some of the sovereignty issues with China and its neighbors. They're not all maritime issues, although we pay an awful lot of attention to them these days. But China has also had significant boundary disputes and continues to have disputes with some of its land neighbors as well. It's a very large country. Also important to understand is access to resources. This is not the whole economic picture of China, but it helps you understand the maritime dimensions of this much better. The Strait of Malacca, by the way, is where 96% of resources go from the Middle East through the Straits of Hormuz, down around South Asia, through the Straits of Malacca, and up to Japan, China, Korea, and all of the other countries of Asia. So a huge choke point. If you go to PACOM, or if you have PACOM come to speak to you, they have a briefing PowerPoint, and they talk about their area of operation, their AOR. Okay, Hawaii's over here, right? And this is their choke point, right? This is one of their major pieces of maritime space that they see as critical to American national security interests as well. So you can get out and around by other straits, but just to show you that that's a pretty significant passageway. Chinese oil and gas, of course, now is increasingly coming out of the Straits of Hormuz, and so we are going to see a lot more Chinese attention to maritime patrols on this side of the Indian subcontinent. And already they're building bases, a string of pearls is the way they refer to them, but there will be bases there for their maritime protection of their sea lanes as well. So you can see, this is not just it's not just about military power, it's deeply about economic power as well. The maritime boundaries, I like to talk about maritime boundaries largely because we don't always know what we're talking about when we talk about maritime boundaries. The United States sits over here in North America. We have big open oceans on both sides of us, so we don't have to have these kinds of conversations very often with our neighbors, although there's a really interesting case history between Maine and between us and Canada, right? Where we have negotiated our maritime boundary. And again, up in the Pacific Northwest, at one point, the British and the Americans also had a pretty intense negotiation about where their maritime boundary was. But we don't often think about maritime boundaries the same way that countries in Asia do. This is from my book, and again, I don't want to go on too much. It's a kind of complicated map, but this is really to show you, if I can find my red dot, there it is. So across the East China Sea is not 400 nautical miles, and the UN Law of the Sea created this concept of exclusive economic zones, which means that up to 200 nautical miles off your coast, you can claim exclusive control over the seabed and all other marine resources. So in areas where you don't have 400 nautical miles, you're expected to negotiate the difference. And often a median line, an agreed upon median line, is where two countries come out. Chinese and Japanese have not come to an agreement. They both ratified UNCLOS in 1996, but they have not agreed on their maritime boundary. It continues to be disputed today. So the Japanese suggestion is a median line that goes like this, and you'll see that the Senkakus are quite clearly on that side. This dotted line that runs up here is China's continental shelf. And that is the Chinese argument for where the maritime boundary ought to be. And they are arguing that their continental shelf gives them an extension under UNCLOS, which other countries also claim, an 150-mile additional maritime space based on the fact that they have a deep geological feature, a continental shelf that allows them to claim more of the sea space and sea resources. The Japanese don't like that because it brings them pretty close very close to Okinawa Trench, which I'll show you in just a second, but it gets them a little bit close to Japanese territorial waters. Again, and it also includes the Senkakus, you'll see right here. So that's another reason to not be happy about it. When the Chinese announced their air defense identification zone in November of 2013, they used the exact same coordinates that they used for their continental shelf claim. So they're very consistent in terms of the basis of their claim of control. An ADIZ, by the way, if you're following military issues, an ADIZ gives you an exclusive control to the airspace, and at least asks anybody entering that airspace to identify yourself and your intentions. So it has a different meaning than an EEZ, which is basically an economic concept, not a concept of any kind of enforcement or military dimensions, right? So that's really the way the story looks. We can talk more about that if you'd like, but that's the outline of the maritime boundary dispute. And it's a new dispute. It began in the mid-1990s, and ironically it began with the arrival of the UN Law of the Sea, which is a maritime regime, right, designed to help countries solve disputes, not create them. But there has created this new dynamic now of competition across the East China Sea. This is more interesting for those of you who are Navy people, who are interested in naval things. Again, here's the Senkaku. If I can find my dot. There it is. Here's the Senkakus. Here's that continental shelf, right? So this is the topography underwater. This is a very deep trough, about 2,000, 2,500 meters, depending on which spot you're in. That is a very nice place for submarines to hang out. Lots of submarine activity there. And you'll notice that Taiwan is right here. And if you're interested in protecting Taiwan, perhaps from some kind of surface action by a navy, a submarine in and around this neighborhood would be a particularly nice asset to have, right? This is Ishigaki. That's the island I pointed to before that has the fishermen, right? This is Naha, where the military bases are, ours and Japanese. And then you really go off here into the Western Pacific, into depths that are beyond 2,000 meters. Yes, sir?
Now, with the International Law of the Sea, there
Yes.
was a court founded in Hamburg. Why hasn't that been sought as a...
So the first country to use the tribunal under the UN Law of the Sea in these Asian maritime disputes is the Philippines. And the Philippines arbitration, called an arbitration tribunal, and I'll get to that in just a second if you'll hold that thought. Japan has not gone to the Law of the Sea. It continues to, there is, under UNCLOS, not really a big fight. There's just a you have to negotiate kind of indication of the UN Law of the Sea. So the UN Law of the Sea would not be able to say one side is right or one side is wrong. Because under the UN Law of the Sea, in fact, they recognize both the continental shelf argument and the argument for a median line. So there is the problem with the UN Law of the Sea is it's an incomplete maritime regime, right? It doesn't have full jurisdiction over resolving these kinds of differences yet. But perhaps there's an argument to be made for it to mature a little bit. But let me show you the Philippine case in just a second. So here we are, South China Sea. This is not involving Japan at all. Lost my dot again. There it is. But this will help you understand what's going on today, right? And where the United States is operating and why. So this red line, all this blue line, is the EEZs of all of these coastal countries around here, right? So you've got Malaysia, Indonesia, again Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, etc., all the way up, right? They all have claims of maritime boundaries, and they have negotiated boundaries between themselves of what constitutes their legitimate maritime EEZ, right? Those are the blue lines. The red line is what the Chinese claim they refer to this as the 9- line or the 11- line, depending on which, it's just the same thing, but sometimes they have 11 dashes and sometimes they have 9. The Vietnamese also recognize this in an interesting way historically. They don't recognize it legally, but they used to call it the ox's tongue. So you'll see it looks like an ox's tongue. And in the Chinese literature, historical literature, that's also how it was referred to. But this is the space where the Chinese today say that part of their territory was actually taken from them during the colonial period in Asia. So if you look up here, Vietnam was occupied, of course, by the French, right? Woody Island and these islands up here, the Paracels, were also claimed by the French. So you go back in history and look at the dispute. It begins to take on the French versus the Chinese at some point in history in the 19th century, right? So these stories go back a little earlier than this post-World War II period. Scarborough, of course, there's been a whole bunch of treaties that go back and try and define how many islands actually belong to the Philippines. But as you can see, the Philippines is an archipelago. It has thousands of islands in its country, right? Scarborough Shoal is a very tiny shoal, which means it's rocks. It doesn't necessarily constitute a livable space. The reed bank is similarly the same. At high tide, it disappears, right? Low tide, it reappears. It's not an island, technically speaking, under the UN Law of the Sea, Article 21. Nonetheless, the Chinese have taken Scarborough Shoal, frankly, and they're about to take Reed Bank. In the Spratlys, there are many claimants. So all of these countries here have a claim on the Spratlys. And the 3 islands that you see, if you haven't seen it yet, you should just Google CNN embedded in Poseidon over the South China Sea, and it'll pop right up. And what that means is a CNN reporter was on top of an American surveillance ship, aircraft rather, that went over the top of the Chinese reclamation. There's also a program at CSIS in Washington called the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, the website. It will tell you blow by blow by blow about the development in the land reclamation projects, and it'll give you some surveillance photographs as well. Long and the short of it, back to the tribunal issue, is the Philippines has asked the UNCLOS tribunal to decide whether it is qualified to adjudicate China's claim on the 9-dash line. And they have come back very recently and said, yes, we will take it on. And what they're asking is, we'll see how this evolves, but basically what the Philippines was asking UNCLOS to do was to make a decision about whether this historical claim by China was legitimate under international law, modern international law.
How old is the ox tongue?
The ox tongue goes back, the Chinese say it goes back dynasties. Okay? And the interesting thing about the Chinese position, and again, I'm not saying this to criticize the Chinese, not everybody is consistent when they use international law. We all know that. Sometimes we're not very consistent either. But the Chinese on the East China Sea use a different argument. They use the continental shelf argument, which is a scientifically acceptable argument under UNCLOS, right? But when it comes to the South China Sea, they claim a historical argument. And they say this was ours, it was taken from us, it is our natural space, right? On the Spratlys themselves, on those big islands, reclaimed islands, the Chinese government and experts will typically say, but we're not the first ones to build up islands in this group. If you go up to the Parasols, the Vietnamese have huge facilities on their islands. If you come down here, the Filipinos and Malaysians and others have facilities built up on their islands too. So why are you picking on us? And I think the general response is they look like military bases. Yes.
So, quick question.
Yes.
If China were to succeed, in getting all of these islands, what would their next step be? Are they going to try and access the resources underneath? Is it simply freedom of fishing, or is it really just a nationalism issue?
So I will defer to the Chinese politics specialist in the room, but here's what I've been involved in a lot of the Track 1.5 initiatives, which talk between Americans and Chinese experts about these issues, right? Two things. One is very recently when Xi Jinping came to Washington, right? The South China Sea was actually a huge point of contention on our side, on the U.S. side. Xi Jinping and his government delegation did not speak about it in the private conversations, but when she was leaving in the press conference, he had a one-line sentence that says, "We will not militarize the South China Sea." So all over Washington and the think tank world, everybody's saying, well, what does that mean, right? And nobody in his delegation anticipated the statement, frankly, and there's no real serious yet sort of consolidated meaning for what that one sentence meant. 2 days after he left town, the Center for Naval Analysis has a regular Track 1.5 with the PLA. Really good, rich military-to-military discussion, right, in our think tank world. And very high-ranking general was the head delegation. She brought, it was very fun. She brought maritime, she brought Navy, she brought Air Force, she brought ground armies. And so our side always peppering them with questions. So what did Xi Jinping mean by that one sentence? And she's like, we don't know. We have no idea. We're going to have to go back to Beijing and try to find out. But the interesting off the record, since we're off the record,